all the colors. Summer love. Memories washed in every shade of green and all the colors. Summer love. Remember the lazy river day canoe, bathing in the turquoise blue.
Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're doing a quick roundup of some sub $100 ChiFi IEMs. So this isn't exactly a comparison of all of them, it's also not going to be a full in-depth review of all of these IEMs, but I will cover off some basics like what the tip selection is like, what the cable is like, and then of course how they sound. I'm not going to compare all of them to one another, but I will provide some comparative comments along the way to help contextualize where I think there's good value and where I think it's maybe worth spending a little bit more or not worth spending a little bit more. And so without any further ado, let's jump into it with the BLON Fat Girls. These are probably an unfortunately named IEM. I don't know that it's necessarily the best naming convention being used here, but I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to the geeky audio store from AliExpress for sending me out the Fat Girls. These are a $10 IEM, and that's not a typo in my notes. It is a $10 IEM, and what you get for your $10 is this relatively nice looking and feeling pair of in-ear monitors. They use more of the bullet style approach, so they're a straight in type of fit. They're going to stick out of the ear just a little bit, but they're fairly compact, so not too badly. And they're running, as you'd expect from such a tiny shell, just a single dynamic driver. For your $10, what you're getting as well is a fixed cable, and not a particularly special cable, but it's completely okay for $10, and probably better in some ways, other than not being detachable, better in some ways than some of the others I've got here. I'd describe the fit and comfort of these as decent. I'm not generally a huge fan of these kind of bullet style, straight in the ear type IEMs, but these are okay, and for $10, there's nothing to complain about. In terms of their sound quality, the tonality is fairly balanced. It's not too bad at all. But you can hear a lack of refinement. You can hear that they're a cheap IEM. And the reason I say that is the treble's not the most smooth, it's not harsh or sibilant, but there's just a general sense of a lack of refinement, I guess I'd say. It's across all of the frequency ranges, nothing is nasty or harsh, tonally they're actually quite well balanced, they've got a nice solid sense of bass that's not bloated or boomy, it's not the tightest or best controlled bass, but it's completely fine. And ultimately, that's kind of how I'd sum up the Fat Girls. They're a completely fine IEM. If you were looking for just a beta IEM where you don't care about breaking it, then I think they're a decent option. But definitely you can get significantly better performance by spending a bit more money. And specifically, one of the IEMs that I think is excellent value for money, and therefore that I compared it to, is an IEM that I have reviewed previously, so you can check out the review of that one if you want to, and it's the CCA CRA. I covered this one off in a previous roundup similar to this one, and at $21, the CRA for me is a clear upgrade over the Fat Girl. Yes, it's double the price, so it should be, but at $21, it's still very affordable, and in my mind, it gives you everything the Fat Girls give you, only better refined and better controlled. So if you're just looking for a knockaround IEM, or you really want to minimize your expenses, then definitely the Fat Girl's fine, it's okay, but the CRA is clearly an improvement and still very, very affordable. And so let's jump over now to a different IEM that was also provided by the Geeky Audio Store, so thanks again to them, and that's the KZ ESX. Now, I recently did a review of a bunch of KZ models, and specifically some of the models that were kind of embroiled in that controversy around fake drivers or disconnected drivers, and I'm not going to get into any of that here because in the case of the ESX, it's just a single dynamic driver IEM, so it works fine, the driver is clearly connected because it produces sound, and the reality is the sound's quite good. And I'll get to that in a moment, but before we do, let's talk a bit about the accessories and the tips for this one. And that is to say that it comes with a detachable cable, but it's a fairly basic cable. At the $18 price tag, it's kind of about what you'd expect, maybe a bit below what you'd expect depending on what else you've tried, but it's completely serviceable and completely fine. The tip selection is limited, you just get 3 different sizes, but they're a decent quality tip and the comfort's pretty good. The shells on these are a molded style shell and they're quite a striking design. They still look a bit cheap. The plastic looks and feels like a cheaper grade plastic, and the front, although it's metal, does still feel a bit cheap. But having said that, for $18, I think they look and feel pretty good. As I've already said, inside the shell is just a single dynamic driver. And you'll find that as we go through this entire roundup, I think almost all of them, if not all of them, are single dynamic driver designs. And that's quite a good thing. If you're talking about a cheap IEM, you don't want necessarily to be buying IEMs with lots of different drivers, because that should be taking a lot more R&D, it should have more componentry in it, and therefore it kind of should cost a bit more money. Whereas a well-tuned single dynamic driver IEM should be relatively easy to make for someone that's obviously knows what they're doing, and therefore can keep the cost down while still giving you great performance. And indeed, that's definitely been my experience with the KZ ESX. This for me is a really, really nice sounding IEM for just $18. Much like the CCA CRA that I mentioned a moment ago, the ESX is a much more refined sound than the BLON Fat Girl. At just $18, this is another IEM that I would clearly recommend over the Fat Girl, because it's giving you excellent quality sound at a very, very reasonable price. And in fact, in many ways, I think it's slightly better than the CRA and also a little bit cheaper. It's got what I would describe as a slightly Harman-esque tuning. Now, I haven't measured these at the time of recording, so I can't say exactly what the frequency response looks like, but what I will say is they clearly have a nice sense of sub-bass emphasis, that sort of deep lower end punch and thump, as well as a slightly upper mid and lower treble forward sound. And so I do find that an IEM that's tuned like this can start to come across just a little bit forceful sometimes in vocals and some percussion, but it's pretty well handled in the ESX. It's not exactly my preferential tuning, but it's certainly very, very enjoyable and much more refined, as I said, than the Fat Girl. I also find it to be slightly better controlled than the CRA, which is tuned in a very similar way. They've got slightly different points of emphasis, and I think the ESX controls it all just ever so slightly better. So far out of these three, that being the very cheap Fat Girl, the slightly more expensive than this CRA, and now this at $18, the ESX at $18 would definitely be my pick of the three. But of course, this wouldn't be a roundup if I stopped there, and so let's move on now to a very different option in the Tangzhu Shimin Li. And hopefully I'm not completely butchering that name. If you're someone that speaks Chinese, and I don't know if it's Cantonese or Mandarin, but if you speak Chinese and you want to correct my pronunciation, please let me know down below how that's meant to be said. But for now, I'm going to call them the Shimin Lis. The Shimin Lis were provided to me by Melbourne ChiFi Audio, so I want to say thanks to Andy over at Melbourne ChiFi Audio for sending these through. And the very first thing I want to say about them is that they're a beautiful looking and feeling IEM. These come in at just $35, and the first thing I thought to myself was, how are they making an IEM like this for that price? They're a beautiful solid metal shell. When I say solid metal, it's obviously made in pieces and then put together, but they're a very solid feeling and beautifully made all metal IEM shell. Attached to them is a detachable cable that feels lovely. It's a really tight weave, it's a nice rubberized finish, and it feels really high quality. On top of that, you're getting a bunch of different tips to choose from. And so, as I said, I don't know how they're doing it for $35, but you're getting a beautiful, beautiful looking and feeling IEM. Once again, as is the trend in this roundup, they're a single dynamic driver again, and this time it's tuned a bit differently. It's quite a relaxed, smooth and enjoyable sound that on first listen doesn't sound like you're losing any detail or any texture at all. As you'll hear in a moment with a brief comparison, I think there is a little bit of detail and texture missing, but it's not in a bad way. And so these are really going to suit certain listeners depending on your preferences, but we'll get to that in a second. As I compared these with the ESX, the thing that I noticed the most was that they've got a more laid back sound, that being the Shimin Lis. They've got a sound that's just a little bit more easy to listen to. They don't have that slight forcefulness or forwardness of something like the ESX. It does mean that they don't have the same level of treble detail and treble forwardness, but I actually found myself enjoying them because of that. Without having seen any measurements for these, it's hard for me to nail down exactly what they've done in the tuning, but I'm guessing it's actually more about the speed of the decay of the driver rather than the actual tuning itself. Now clearly I don't think they've got the upper mid-range and lower treble forwardness that, say, the ESX does, but I think in addition to that, they've got a bit more weight, they've got a slightly slower sound, and so I'm guessing that the way the driver has been damped and controlled is just allowing the notes to linger a little bit longer and provide that greater sense of smoothness and richness in the sound. Comparing again to the KZ ESX, the bass from these isn't quite as punchy or fast or controlled, and some people aren't going to like that about the Shimin Lis. but I didn't find when I listened to them in isolation that I had any complaints about the bass. The bass is present and solid, it doesn't sound bloated or bloomy, but when I put them up against the ESX, I could hear that there was a greater sense of control and punch and speed from the ESX. That would also suggest that the tuning of these probably has their bass emphasis going a little bit higher in the range, whereas the ESX keeps it all pretty low, but the end result of it for me was that the Shimin Li was a tuning that I really thoroughly enjoyed. Another benefit of their sound is they produce a wonderfully coherent but well-focused soundstage. Sometimes with IEMs that are tuned similar to the ESX, that forwardness of sound can start to make some of the mid-range sounds less coherent, they're less glued together in the mix. Now obviously we don't want to go in the other direction and end up with a single blob of sound, but I find the Shimin Lis balance it really nicely. There's a good sense of coherency where everything feels connected in the mix, but also a really good sense of separation and focus of the image. And so while I think you're trading off a little bit of texture and detail for the Shimin Lis, what you're getting in return is a really organic and natural presentation that's a little bit on the side of being laid back and smooth and easier to listen to. I previously reviewed the more expensive Yuan Li, also from Tangzhu, and I almost feel like this cheaper version is a better IEM. Now I haven't put them side by side, but I think in listening to these, I was immediately enjoying them more. I was a bit more engaged and excited by their sound compared to the even more relaxed sound that I got from the Yuan Lis. Take that with a grain of salt because it's all going from memory and I haven't contextualized it. But what I can say is I'm very impressed with these for their $35 price tag. To round this one out, if you were to get your hands on both the Shimin Li and the ESX, something I'd predict happening is a lot of people are going to plug in the ESX and be immediately more wowed by it. Because it puts the details forward in the mix, because it's quite energetic, at first it is the IEM that you're likely to listen to and go, that's the better listen. But for me, as I spend a bit more time with them, this is the one that I found myself enjoying more. This is the one that for me I wanted to listen to for longer and more often. Whereas the ESX was the one that was initially more impressive and more exciting. Now at these sorts of prices, you could easily own both and they're different enough that it's worth having both potentially. Or of course, you could combine what you'd spend on those two and spend a bit more if it's worth it, and we'll get to that now. The next step up in the roundup is the KBE Inc. These were sent to me by Keep Hi-Fi, and I want to say a huge thanks to Keep Hi-Fi for sending these through. And I have to say, this is the first KBE IEM that I've been somewhat impressed with. I've been quite disappointed with some previous models, but these are a really nice IEM. At $69, you are taking a bit of a leap up in terms of price. But what you're getting for your money is a beautifully designed IEM that feels nice, looks great. It comes with a fantastic range of tips and also another really nice cable. I don't know if I'd say it's better or just on par with the cable from the Shimin Lis, but either way, it's probably one of the two best cables and tip combinations in this entire roundup. We're once again working with another single dynamic driver IEM here, and this time we're returning to that more kind of Harman-esque tuning. What I mean by that is there's a bit of a lift in the sub-bass area, and a slightly forward sense of upper mid-range and lower treble details. The end result is a really clean and very detailed sound that I think a lot of people would really enjoy. I personally find the sound to be ever so slightly V-shaped and therefore lacking a bit of weight and reality in the mid-range at times. But that's very much a personal preference that I have, and I know that a lot of people lean towards that more sort of Harman-esque tuning that I think these are matching. And what these do definitely do well is combining a wonderful sense of clarity and detail and speed with still a good sense of deep bass presence and thump when you need it. And so for me, the comparison with the inks is not so much the Shimin Lis, even though they're the one step down in price, so much as it is the KZ ESX. The KZ ESX and the inks are much closer aligned in terms of their tuning, and I think they both have their pros and cons. So putting aside the look and the feel of the IEMs, which would clearly go to the inks in my opinion, putting that aside, I think the inks are presenting you with a sound which is a little bit more detailed, a little bit more sense of that clarity and that attack and that texture, while the ESX is giving you a little bit more mid-range presence, which I quite like, but it's coming also at the expense of a slightly smaller and less separated soundstage. And so fans of clarity and detail and texture would definitely want to go for the inks. But if you like that little bit more presence and weight in the mids and you're willing to give up a little bit of space and stage for it, then I think the ESX at the much cheaper price is still an excellent choice. And so at this point, we've got 3 IEMs that I think are really, really worthy. I found the Fat Girl to be okay for the price, but it's probably a little bit disappointing overall in this roundup. And so the 3 that have really stood out to me is that the ESX provides excellent value for money for that sort of Harman-esque tuning. You've then got the Shimin Li, which provides a lovely, different tuning that's a bit more laid back, very enjoyable, very musical. And then you've got your very clarity-focused, energetic sort of sound without going too far and getting too forward or too aggressive in the form of the KB Inc. The final IEM that I have here to review, and it's sort of two IEMs in a way, is the new Moondrop Aria Snow. The Aria Snow is a new version of the original Aria, but as I understand it, both are going to live side by side. So you've got the original Aria, which I wasn't always a huge fan of, and then you've got the Snow. I want to say a huge thanks to Appos for sending me the Snow for review, and the Snow is priced identically to the standard Aria at $80. So these are the top priced IEMs in this roundup, and therefore there's an expectation that they should perform according to their price. In the case of the Aria, they're a good IEM, but they're not an IEM that I absolutely love. And so I was curious to see if the Snow could fix the tuning for me, in terms of my tastes, or if it was going to go further in the other direction. What you get with the Snows is an IEM that has the exact same size and shape and general design as the Aria, the original Aria. But on this occasion, it's now this lovely silver design with a very simple kind of snowflake pattern on it. It's a very elegant and attractive looking IEM. I probably should also mention at this stage that all of the IEMs other than the Fat Girl in this review have been generally equally comfortable. They're all this kind of molded design that sits into the ear a little bit, and they're all quite comfortable depending on your tip choice. In the case of the Aria Snow, the cable's just okay. I feel like at $80 when you're comparing things like the Shimin Li and also the KBE Inc, I'd expect a little bit better in terms of the cable, but it's serviceable and it's decent enough. Instead of the nice cloth twisted cable that came with the original Arias, we've now got this kind of silver single sheath cable that I'm pretty sure I've seen before on very cheap earphones from places like BLON, but as I said, it's serviceable and it's okay. This is also once again a single dynamic driver design, and the good news is that the overall tuning of it is absolutely fantastic. Having not particularly enjoyed the original Arias, I absolutely enjoy the Aria Snow. The most immediate thing that I noticed from them was their incredible ability to focus the image and produce a nice sense of separation of all the sounds. Now, I don't for a second suggest that these are on the level of $1,000 plus IEMs, but within this roundup, these were a clear standout in terms of their image and their general sound separation. The soundstage isn't necessarily huge and expansive, but it's incredibly well separated into each individual instrument. I also think the tonality of these is very well balanced, and it comes with a good sense of overall refinement. So all frequencies are well controlled, they're well balanced in the mix, and they're just a joy to listen to. In listening to them for a while, I think they still have a Harman-esque type of lean, but what I like about the Aria Snow is the bass lift is a bit higher up in the register. What I find happens in a lot of the Harman-esque tunings is that they lift the sub-bass, and then there's actually a bit of a trough through the mid-bass and into the lower mids, and it can cause a slightly hollow sound and overly separate the bass from the mids and the treble. In the case of the Aria Snow, that's not happening. By bringing the bass lift just up a little bit in the frequency range, it ties together the whole overall frequency response into a beautifully coherent sonic picture. And so as you're probably gathering from what I'm saying here, the Aria Snow are a very enjoyable listening experience. Jumping back and forth between the KZ ESX and the Aria Snow, the ESX sounds decidedly shouty when you compare it to these. And that's not because the ESX is a particularly shouty IEM to start with, it's just that the Aria Snows have been so beautifully tuned. The ESX does have the slightly punchier bass, and it's probably due to where exactly that bass emphasis has been placed. But what the ESX then loses, and it's more important to me, is that wonderful sense of imaging and focus that the Aria Snow has. So I would trade off that little bit of punchiness in the bass from the ESX for what the Aria Snow is giving me every day of the week. The Aria Snow is not lacking in bass, it's not slow or bloated, it's just not quite as snappy and punchy as the ESX. For those of you wondering how the Aria Snow compares to the original Aria comes across sounding a bit thinner. And that comes back to what I just talked about a few moments ago, which is that with the original Aria, the lift in the bass was lower down towards the sub-bass, and it did leave a little bit of a disconnect between the upper mids and the bass. That makes the mid-range overall sound a bit thinner, a bit drier, and for me that's really the biggest difference from a tonal point of view, is that the Aria Snow manages to bring everything together into a nice, clean, coherent whole from the bass all the way through to the treble. In addition to that, it manages to produce a soundstage which is a bit more distant from the listener. I don't know that it's necessarily a bigger soundstage than the original Aria, but I do believe that it's just a little bit further away and each individual note and sound is better focused, which ends up being a much better overall imaging and staging experience. And so for me, the Aria Snow is clearly an upgrade, and it's clearly the better IEM based on my listening preferences and what I tried it with. This is always a subjective hobby, so some of you might still prefer the original Aria, but I definitely think the Snow is the better IEM. I think it's better from a tonal balance point of view, I think it's better from a staging point of view, and I definitely think it's better in terms of its imaging focus. And so having covered off all of these, I just want to give you a quick summary of where I landed and what my conclusions were from trying all of these sub $100 IEMs, and keeping in mind that I've contextualized these by comparing them to standouts from the previous roundups I've done, such as the CCA CRA. And where I've landed after all of this is that for me, the KZ ESX is really a bit of a sweet spot for value and performance. At $18 US, you're getting a wonderfully performing IEM. That's not the best thing ever. As I've already said, things like the Aria Snow, for me, are clearly better than it. But for $18 US, the value for money and the price to performance ratio is really strong in the KZ ESX. Another standout for me is the Tangzhu Shimin Li, and that's because it's a completely different tuning that's really nicely executed and a wonderful feeling IEM in terms of the cable quality, the tip selection, and the IEM shells themselves. And so that's another one that I think is worth checking out at its $35 US price tag. But for me, the absolute winner if you have a budget of up to $100 US has got to be the Aria Snow. It's a bit of a shame that the accessory quality isn't as good as some of those cheaper IEMs, but the general and overall sound quality from the Aria Snow is nothing short, in my opinion, of exceptional for the price. It combines a great sense of detail and focus in the soundstage, with a good balance of tonality that is both rich and smooth, but still plenty of detail and texture. It's comfortable, it looks elegant, and really, it's just an excellent overall IEM. I can actually imagine that if you paired it up with some high quality tips, like say some spin fits, or some Final Audio E-type tips, anything like that, combine it with that and a nice aftermarket cable, and you'd have yourself an IEM that looks and feels like a much more expensive model. And so I'd say that if you're in the market for a sub $100 ChiFi IEM, then I would definitely recommend checking out the KZ ESX, the Tangzhu Shimin Li, and or the Moondrop Aria Snow. If you're thinking about an upgrade from the original Aria, I definitely think it's worth checking out the Snow. And so as always, I'll pop some links down below through to the various stores where you can pick these up for yourself. Some of them are affiliate links, some of them aren't. That doesn't influence what I've said here. For example, the KZ ESX is not an affiliate link, but it's absolutely one that I'm going to recommend. Likewise, the Shimin Li, also not an affiliate link, but I'm going to recommend that one too, because it's a nice sounding IEM. And so check out the links below, pick up one of these or many of these if you're interested. And as always, if you found this review useful, helpful, or just generally entertaining, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.